Chapter 25. That sinking feeling. You think you are doing the pushing, but it is you who are being pushed. Mephistopheles in Goethe's Faust. On 13th of May, 5 days after Spender and Kermode resigned, Michael Josselson and John Hunt found themselves sitting in what had been Josselson's office on the second floor of the Boulevard Haussmann. Josselson, accompanied by Diana and Jennifer, had arrived in Paris from Geneva, where, from his sparsely elegant flat in the Plateau du Champel, he had been battling tirelessly for the past weeks to contain the fallout. In the streets below the Boulevard Haussmann, cafes were opening to welcome the Saturday shoppers as they disgorged into the spring sunshine. Somewhere amongst them, Diana was taking Jennifer to buy a costume for her end-of-term ballet recital. But she was distracted and moved through the crowd towards the Galeries Lafayette, feeling strangely disengaged. In a room adjoining the office where Josselson and Hunt sat, the General Assembly of the Congress for Cultural Freedom was locked in conference. Chaired by Minu Masani, leader of the opposition party in India, the meeting consisted of Raymond Aron, Daniel Bell, Pierre Emmanuel, Louis Fisher, Anthony Hartley, K.A.B. Jones-Cordy, Ezekiel Mafalel, Nicholas Nabokov, Hans Oprecht, Michael Polanyi, Denis de Rougemont, Yoshihiko Seki, Edward Shills, Ignacio Salone, and Manes Sperber. Flying in from all corners of the globe, their unenviable task was to pass judgment on Josselson and Hunt, whose letters of resignation lay on the table before them, and to decide the fate of the Congress. Sitting like philosopher kings, they knew that their word would be final. Mike and I sat in his office most of the day, right beside the meeting room. Remember John Hunt. We sat there alone. What do you do at such a moment with the jury across the hall? Fern Michael sat in silence, his slender, well-manicured fingers drumming on the desk. He looked tired of waiting here this morning, tired from the last 2 decades of relentless work. His hair was side-parted and combed across the dome of his head, revealing a high forehead and small eyes at the center of which sat huge black pupils. The jury, meanwhile, debated the evidence. For 2 decades, Michael Josselson had maintained an enormous lie, with John Hunt a secondary transgressor, having been involved in the deception for only half that time. The seriousness of this concealment had immediate implications for hundreds of people. Beyond that, it presented a moral dilemma that would never be easily resolved. Both men had made statements about their relationship with the CIA and its relationship, in turn, to the Congress. Josselson had accepted full responsibility for what he still maintained had been a necessary lie. The General Assembly's opprobrium was by no means guaranteed. Sperber, Polanyi, and Salone spoke up for Josselson and Hunt and urged the Assembly to take a fighting position. Sperber said something to the effect of, "To hell with all this. We don't care what the New York Times says. We helped set this up and run it for 15 years. We've dealt with tougher things than this in our political life, so let's just go on as before, if there's support for it." 2. But there wasn't. Aaron and Emmanuel especially were bound to see things a little differently. As Frenchmen belonging to an organization based in Paris, which was now tainted by associations with American intelligence, their reputations hung in the balance. They had a huge stake in this, Hunt later said. Aaron, in fact, was so vexed by the matter before him that he withdrew stormily from the meeting, slamming the door as he left the room. By lunchtime, no agreement had been reached, and at Masani's suggestion, they took a break. Reconvening in the afternoon, the meeting dragged on until finally, at 6 o'clock, Nabokov and de Rougemont appeared before Josselson and Hunt, the draft statement of the Assembly in their hands. They read it out to Michael, me and Hunt, said Diana, who had left Jennifer with a friend to admire her new tutu and taken up position at her husband's side. It was shameful. There was no reference to Michael's and John's contribution. Michael and John went pale-faced and walked out. Nicholas and Denise said to me, "What do you think?" I said, "I think it stinks." I think I was weeping. For why, asked Diana from behind bitter tears, was there no mention of Michael's devotion to the Congress, his unswerving dedication to the cause of cultural freedom? Why had they ignored the fact that without Michael, and indeed John, there would have been no Congress at all? Was this how intellectuals repaid the man to whom they were all indebted? Raising their skirts and fleeing at the first sign of trouble? Was no one prepared to stand and fight? At this point, Nabokov, always a man of flamboyant gestures, clutched his chest and had, or faked, a heart episode. Somebody was dispatched to get a glass of water and an aspirin. His confusion at this moment, if not the swooning fit, was genuine. What could Michael have expected? These were his friends, and he had misled them all these years. He had concealed the fact that he was a CIA employee, that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was the child of a covert CIA operation. What metal was he made of that he now showed such indignant hurt? Did he really believe himself to be a man more sinned against than sinning? Suddenly Nabokov, the man whose fortunes had been so deeply linked to Jocelson's, began to see more clearly. This was Michael's life, his faith. It was all he had. There was nothing else. Nabokov and de Rougemont, horrified at the idea they had behaved ungraciously, promised Diana that they would persuade the General Assembly to redraft the statement. Mollified, Diana went out to look for Michael and John. A while later, they listened as the revised communiqué was read out. The next day, it was released to the world's press. The General Assembly expressed deep regret that the information conveyed to it had confirmed reports that Central Intelligence Agency funds had been used, and that the executive director should have found it necessary to accept such aid without the knowledge of any of his colleagues. The Assembly affirmed its pride in the achievements of the Congress since its establishment in 1950. It wished to express its conviction that its activities had been entirely free of influence or pressure from any financial backers, and its confidence in the independence and integrity of all those who had collaborated in its work. It condemned in the strongest terms the way in which the CIA had deceived those concerned and had caused their efforts to be called into question. The effect of such action, the Assembly stated, tends to poison the wells of intellectual discourse. The Assembly repudiated entirely the employment of such methods in the world of ideas. The Assembly took note of the resignations tendered by Michael Jocselson and John Hunt. It expressed its renewed gratitude to them for the fact that despite the difficulties attendant on the mode of financing of Congress activities, they maintained the complete independence and intellectual integrity of the organization and consequently requested them to continue to perform their duties. 5. The wording of the statement was, in many ways, disingenuous. Firstly, Josselson's resignation was accepted by the Assembly. This was later confirmed by both Diana Josselson and John Hunt, who said, "My distinct recollection was that Mike, whatever the minutes may say, was in effect told that he couldn't stay on. I was in a different category, in their minds, so this didn't apply to me." 6. Secondly, and more importantly, it was simply inadequate to say that Josselson had accepted CIA aid without the knowledge of any of his colleagues. I can tell you that several of the most important Congress people knew the truth because their governments had told them, Hunt later revealed. Aaron was told. Malrox obviously knew. And so did Muggeridge and Warburg, who were told by MI6 after the two agencies reached an agreement regarding encounter. 7. Who didn't know? I'd like to know. It was a pretty open secret. 8, said Lawrence de Neufville. The list of those who knew, or thought they knew, is long enough. Stuart Hampshire, Arthur Schlesinger, Edward Shills, who confessed to Natasha Spender that he had known since 1955, Denise de Rougemont, Daniel Bell, Louis Fisher, George Kerman, Arthur Kussler, Junkie Fleischman, Francois Bondy, James Burnham, Willie Brandt, Sidney Hook, Melvin Lasky, Jason Epstein, Mary McCarthy, Pierre Emanuel, Lionel Trilling, Diana Trilling, Sol Levitas, Robert Oppenheimer, Sol Stein, Dwight McDonald. Not all of them were witting in the sense that they were active participants in the deception. But they all knew and had known for some time. And if they didn't, they were, said their critics, cultivatedly and culpably ignorant. Mike did try and tell some people, but they said they didn't want to know, Hunt claimed. They knew, and they knew as much as they wanted to know, and if they knew any more, they knew they would have had to get out, so they refused to know. 9. Attending the General Assembly meeting as an observer was the Australian poet James Macaulay, founding editor of Quadrant. He noted that there was a contradiction between their wish to, 1, support Mike in friendship and in honesty because none of them had been really much deceived, and 2, take up a public position of outraged innocence. Hunt's wife, Chantal, who who had worked for the French Ministry of Culture and briefly for the Congress, was dismissive of such moral fuzziness. Everyone in France, in my circle at least, knew the truth about who was behind the Congress, she claimed. They all talked about it. They would say, "Why do you want to go and work there? It's CIA." Everyone knew except, apparently, those who worked for it. Isn't that odd? I always thought so. 11. Mostly they all denied knowing anything about it, said Diana Josselson, but they made crummy liars. 12. And what of Nicholas Nabokov, who had made every step of the journey from those early days in Berlin to this painful denouement in Paris alongside Josselson? Did he really believe his own angry rebuttal to charges of CIA involvement, in which he had said, "I deny everything"? The Congress for Cultural Freedom has never had any link, direct or indirect, with the CIA. The whole thing has been set up by the Soviets. 13. Could anyone seriously believe that Nabokov, in all these years, had never been told, or figured out for himself, that behind this stood the heavy guns of the Virginian woods? His own words. Mary McCarthy's story, in which Nabokov apparently revealed the truth to Spender in a London taxi, suggests otherwise, as does Chantal Hunt's recollection of Nabokov telling her in conspiratorial whispers over lunch one day that he knew. Stuart Hampshire later noted with some irony that Nabokov wasn't particularly devastated at the revelations. 14th Eve. As Nabokov stood before Josselson on that miserable day of 13th of May, waving a resolution in his face which condemned him for deceiving his colleagues, the fact that he was eminently unsuited to pass judgment appeared not to drive a fume across his mind. In his memoirs, Nabokov damned the abysmal and needless impropriety of the method of thinking, or absence of thinking, that preceded the decision to pass money through the CIA to cultural organizations. 15, he added that this was especially glaring when one thinks that the Cold War was the toughest, most complex ideological war since the early 19th century, and that this impropriety occurred in a country that used to have a century-old tradition of what Camus called moral forms of political thinking. It still hurts me to think of those wanton bruises of immorality and the fact that a marvelous structure built with love and care by brilliantly intelligent, dedicated, and profoundly incorruptible free-thinking men and women was dragged into the mud and destroyed because of the oldest and most persistent hubris, unreasoned action. 16. Privately, though, Nabokov showed nothing of this moral indignation. "I do not feel that one should be apologetic about the funding of the Congress from the CIA," he told one correspondent. "Many of us suspected some sort of funding of this kind, and it was the talk of the town in many capitals of Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Africa. The point is not the funding, but what the Congress has done." 17. Feeling much like a contemporary Job, the perfect and upright man harassed for his virtue, Josselson left Paris after first seeing his doctors and then meeting McGeorge Bundy, presumably to discuss the implications for the CIA of the exposures. According to the Washington Post, McGeorge Bundy was the man who supervised the CIA's operations under Kennedy and Johnson. Back in Geneva, he had barely time to unpack before the volcano erupted. In the wake of the General Assembly's acknowledgement that the CIA had subsidized the Congress, newspapers across the world had a field day. Josselson collapsed, leaving Diana to answer a barrage of angry telephone calls. To the Spenders, she wrote that Josselson's day and night continuous battle under constant strain, trying to save what he can of the Congress's work in some form or another, has me in a state of perpetual worry. The mess continues. It's like a hydra. 18, utterly despondent, she declared, "I want out and a new life, and never to have anything to do with all these people ever again, except on a basis of friendship with those who are friends." 19, but the issue of friendship itself had now become hopelessly confused. "My dear Mike," wrote Natasha Spender, "it's the human aspect which is so distressing. I can see, looking back in the light of present knowledge, that everybody has been a prisoner of this situation in different degrees and ways. It must have been awful for you to have to deceive your friends to whom you have always been so benevolent. But I'm sure it was wrong of the CIA to expect it, for the repercussions in personal torment and relationships are endless. And if one minds intensely, as one does, then one grieves over trusts broken which cannot be retrieved." So it really comes back to the fact that if a colleague withholds information, he is robbing his colleagues of their freedom and their honor, which in turn destroys the trust of their friends, and ultimately, too many people have suffered. I expect that you, too, are relieved to be out of a false situation which robbed you of the right to be candid to your friends. What was really wrong about the silence imposed on you by the CIA is, from their point of view, that requiring you to treat your friends this way was forcing you to adopt the same ethics as the communists, and therefore making their methods of the West somehow on a par with those of the East in that respect. 20? The shitstorm, as Josselson would later refer to it, continued unabating. Incredibly, it was Tom Braden who now whipped it up to new furies when he penned an article for the Saturday Evening Post. Appearing under the headline, "I'm glad the CIA is immoral," in the 20th May edition, it was written, said Braden, to correct the concatenation of inane, misinformed twaddle appearing in the newspapers. But Braden did more than correct inaccuracies. He volunteered hitherto secret information which would never have been uncovered by other means, solid proof to end all the ambiguities and the possibility of any more denials. Explaining that those on the left in 1950s Europe were the only people who gave a damn about fighting communism, 21, he gave a detailed account of how the International Organizations Division had sought convergence with these people. He described the IOD's relationship with American labor officials and even accused Victor Reuther of spending CIA money with less than perfect wisdom. He confirmed that money for the publication of Encounter had been provided by the CIA, and then went on to claim that an agent became an editor of Encounter. He added that CIA agents planted in this way could not only propose anti-communist programs to the official leaders of the organizations, but they could also suggest ways and means to solve the inevitable budgetary problems. Why not see if the needed money could be obtained from American foundations? As the agents knew, the CIA finance foundations were quite generous when it came to the national interest. 22, listing the battery of fronts deployed by the IOD, Braden said that by 1953, we were operating or influencing international organizations in every field. 23. Operating? Influencing? Of course, had he wanted to, he could simply have written of support, friendly advice. This was, after all, the official line which the agency had always spun. The effect of Braden's article was to sink the CIA's covert association with the non-communist left once and for all. So what possessed him to write it? His own explanation was that his old friend Stuart Alsop rang him up in California and asked him to write a piece for the Saturday Evening Post to set the record straight. "I think I regarded it as catching up with history," Braden said. "I was in on the beginning, and it was now 20 years later, and there were still things going on, and my thought was, it's become ridiculous. It's time to stop this pony show." 24, Braden began drafting the article in early March. With a long lead of nearly 3 months, he had plenty of time to finesse it. He and Alsop conferred several times by telephone, and Braden sent several drafts in, each one becoming more and more revelatory. Braden himself claimed he wanted to set the record straight, iron out the mistruths. But in his article, he deliberately disguised code names, giving his own as Warren G. Flaskins when it was Homer D. Hoskins. Why, in the midst of his incendiary revelations, did Braden bother to protect code names? Was he thinking of the secrecy agreement which every CIA agent signed as part of the swearing-in process? When asked about this secrecy agreement, Braden gave an extraordinary answer. "They could have reminded me of my secrecy agreement, but I had forgotten I'd even signed it. Cross my heart, I didn't know I had signed a secrecy agreement. I had signed it, but I didn't remember this. If I had remembered, I wouldn't have done it." 25. If Tom was playing by the rules as a retiree, he would have had to get approval for what he wrote, said Lawrence de Neufville. I don't think he was playing by the rules. 26. There is another scenario, one to which several CIA agents, and even Braden himself, later found themselves attracted. Tom was a company man, and he knew all about the secrecy agreement, said John Hunt. This agreement had been invoked in the past, and Braden, if he was really acting independently, would have had much to fear. My belief is that he was an instrument down the line somewhere of those who wanted to get rid of the NCL, non-communist left. Don't look for a lone gunman. That's mad, just as it is with the Kennedy assassination. There were lots of interested parties. Braden is witting only up to a point. Maybe Richard Helms called him and said, "I've got a job for you." I do believe there was an operational decision to blow the Congress and the other programs out of the water. I discussed Braden's piece with Mike, and we hypothesized that it was part of a coordinated, authorized operation to end the CIA's alliance with the NCL, but we never got to the bottom of it. 27 Jack Thompson also speculated along the same lines. An old device when you want to run down an operation is you blow it. I have an imaginary scenario. President Johnson is sitting at his desk in the Oval Office, and he's shuffling through some papers. He finds a copy of Encounter magazine, and he says, "Hey, what's this?" And someone says, "It's your magazine, Mr. President." And he says, "My magazine? My magazine. These are guys who think my war is wrong, and they're writing in my magazine?" And that's it. 28 Thompson's fictional scenario is worth looking into. Lyndon Baines Johnson was a man of the 1930s, the poor Texas boy afloat in the world of Eastern sophisticates. And he had no truck with all those intellectuals, no sense of the glamour which had surrounded Jack Kennedy's Athenian interlude. Johnson's idea of a cultural festival was limited to something that would please the ladies. 2 years before Braden's article appeared, on the 14th of June, 1965, American intellectuals had turned a White House Festival of the Arts, originally conceived by the Johnsons' advisors as a tool to quiet opposition to the war, into an angry platform on Vietnam. Robert Lowell had refused his invitation, duly noted in his FBI file, as had Edmund Wilson, with a brusqueness that stunned the festival's organizer, Eric Goldman. Dwight MacDonald did attend, but arrived bearing a petition supporting Lowell and denouncing American policy, which was signed by Hannah Arendt, Lillian Hellman, Alfred Kazin, Larry Rivers, Philip Roth, Mark Rothko, William Styron, and Mary McCarthy, among the uninvited. Over dinner, MacDonald collected 9 more signatures, almost coming to blows with Charlton Heston, who accused MacDonald of being short of elementary manners, and asked him, "Are you really accustomed to signing petitions against your host in his home?" 29 Johnson was left with the feeling afterwards that the White House had been taken over by a gang of traitors. 30. The event was an unmitigated disaster, and President Johnson's reaction to it had added bricks to a wall between the president and these groups, according to Eric Goldman. Mercifully, much of the story was unknown, but enough had become public to make the wall seem as impassable as the barbed concrete between East and West Berlin. 31 Johnson was quoted as saying there was a conspiracy between these people to insult him and his office and to hurt their country at a time of crisis. 32, they were sons of bitches, fools, traitors, who had blown a minor event into a situation which could have anything but minor significance. The president also told 2 of his aides, Richard Goodwin and Bill Moyers, that he was not going to have anything more to do with the liberals. "They won't have anything to do with me. They all just follow the communist line. Liberals, intellectuals, communists. They're all the same." 33 James Burnham, who had helped to harness the Congress for Cultural Freedom to the CIA in its earliest days, but who had done so in the interests of a very conservative kind of realpolitik, saw in the shambles proof of what he had long been warning was a fundamental flaw in the CIA's thinking. The CIA mounted most of these activities in the perspective of the non-communist left, he wrote. The CIA estimated the NCL as a reliably anti-communist force, which in action would be, if not pro-Western and pro-American, at any rate not anti-Western and anti-American. This political estimate is mistaken. The NCL is not reliable. Under the pressure of critical events, the NCL loosened. A large portion in this country, as in others, swung toward an anti-American position, and nearly all the NCL softened its attitude toward communism and the communist nations. Thus, the organizational collapse is derivative from the political error. This political error is the doctrine that the global struggle against communism must be based on the NCL, a doctrine fastened on CIA by Allen Dulles. Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and above all Vietnam, have put the NCL doctrine in practice to a decisive test. A large part of the organizations and individuals nurtured by CIA under the NCL prescription end up undermining the nation's will and hampering or sabotaging the nation's security. 34. The idea that Lyndon Johnson might have subsequently interested himself in the dissolution of the CIA's relationship with the non-communist left is not hard to imagine. The most interesting clue to what really happened lies in the question of Braden's secrecy agreement. At 2 p.m. on the Wednesday, 19th of April, 1967, Walt Rostow, Johnson's special assistant, typed a secret memo to the president which read simply, "I assume you know of the forthcoming Braden article on the CIA in the Saturday Evening Post. Here is the story from Dick Helms." Braden's piece appeared in the 20 of May 1967 edition of the Post, fully a month after Rostow had notified the president of it. Richard Helms, who was now director of the CIA, was, according to Rostow's memo, aware of the article and conceivably of its contents also. The CIA had ample time in which to invoke its secrecy agreement with Braden and prevent him publishing the piece. Rostow's memory on the matter was unsure. "I knew Braden only socially as an amiable person to talk to. I don't remember the memorandum. I don't remember his piece," he said. "I assume Helms told me, and I assume I told the president. But it wasn't a big deal. It didn't impress me at the time." 35. Why then would Rostow have bothered to write a secret memo to the president about something which didn't impress him? Anything that would create a political item that would have an effect on the presidency, I would keep him informed. Rostow replied, somewhat contradictorily. In fact, Rostow and Helms had plenty of occasion to keep the president informed. At Rostow's suggestion, Dick Helms had been invited to attend the Tuesday lunch, the most important high-level national security meeting in the Johnson years, because I thought the president should have an intelligence man he could consult with. 37. The subject of discussion at these weekly lunches by 1967 was almost exclusively Vietnam. Another question, why was the CIA so concerned about the Rampart stories that they mounted a full-scale intelligence operation, and yet with Braden, they made no attempt to stop him? I think it's quite probable that they were anxious to get rid of all these things, Braden concluded. Stuart Alsop may have known this. I always assumed that by this time there would have been those in the agency who wanted to get rid of things like this that were virtually blown already. Everyone knew. The cognoscenti and people like Stu certainly knew that these things were all CIA fronts. I always had it in the back of my mind that they wanted it killed, but I can't prove it. 38 Stuart Alsop was a CIA agent according to one high-level CIA official. Other sources said Alsop was particularly helpful to the agency in discussions with officials of foreign governments, asking questions to which the CIA was seeking answers, planting misinformation advantageous to the U.S., and assessing opportunities for CIA recruitment of well-placed foreigners. Stuart's brother Joseph dismissed as absolute nonsense the claim that Stuart was an agent, saying I was closer to the agency than Stu was, though Stu was very close. 39, but he went on, I dare say he did perform some tasks. He did the correct thing as an American. The founding fathers of the CIA were close personal friends of ours. It was a social thing. I have never received $1. I never signed a secrecy agreement. I didn't have to. I've done things for them when I thought they were the right thing to do. I call it doing my duty as a citizen. The CIA did not open itself at all to people it did not trust. Stu and I were trusted, and I'm proud of it. Stuart Alsop referred to Dulles and his crowd as the brave Easterners and reveled in being part of that tight establishment, the Bruderbund. 40. In one crucial respect, Braden's article did not have the expected outcome. His claim that the agency had planted an agent at Encounter could only have been intended to expose that agent and precipitate his resignation. This man, Braden later elaborated, was one of our agents, a man of distinct intellectual achievement and writing ability, and we paid his salary. 41 Irving Kristol, who was now co-editor with Daniel Bell of a journal called The Public Interest, which had been launched with the help of a generous grant of $10,000 from Josselson, was landed right in the soup. When Tom Braden published that article saying that there had been a CIA agent at Encounter, I was furious because I knew damn well that I had not been a CIA agent, and I certainly knew that Steven Spender had not been a CIA agent, he later said. What in God's name Mr. Braden had in mind when he wrote that article, I do not know. 42 Spender, who was never in the frame, said, "I just can't believe it was Crystal. I really can't. I know it wasn't me." 43, that left Lasky. Years later, he was predictably totally scornful of Braden's claim, calling him a doddery, foolish old man. Dismissing the whole affair as so much James Bond melodrama, the syndrome of the spy and the mole network, Lasky said, "I've never edited a CIA magazine, and I never have and never will." 44, who was the CIA agent? "Was it you? Was it me? Was it who?" he replied. "Listen, we did what we did. No, this was a fantasia, and not to be taken seriously, certainly not by historians." 45 Braden, 30 years later, was categorical. There was no fantasy. The Jocelsons were devastated by Braden's betrayal. "I've always kept such nice memories of you at the 6-day bike races, etc., not to mention a high regard for your professional performance, so that I am all the more sad at the gratuitous betrayal of Mike and his friends in your article," wrote Diana. "Your totally false statement clearly implicating Irving K., whom you apparently forgot was completely unwitting, has created a situation of chaos and personal suffering which I believe you cannot imagine, though you may realize you have dealt a death blow to a good magazine. As I know from lived experience through all these grueling years, and as you must know in your heart too, Tom, if ever there was a man who was a free agent who answered only to the dictates of his own conscience, it was Mike." 46. Diana ended by imploring Braden to issue an apology and retract his statement that Jochelson was planted in Congress. Her letter was never answered. Curiously, despite what would technically be known as a flap in the agency, there was apparently only a little bit of concern that this wasn't necessarily the happiest thing that ever happened. 47, Tom Braden got off without any official censure. Furthermore, the careers of those agents who had been closely involved with the blown NCL program were in no way prejudiced. Cord Meyer and his cohorts all moved swiftly on to bigger and better things. In Meyer's case, to become London Station Chief with responsibility for the entire CIA operation in Western Europe. Only those who had been recruited from the non-communist left itself were now deemed dispensable. Roby McCauley got scuffed around a bit, and according to Diana Jochelson, eventually they squeezed him out. He left the agency and Kenyon Review for a job as fiction editor of Playboy magazine. John Thompson, who had begun flirting with the New Left in the mid-1960s, was also dropped from what he liked to call the good ship Lollipop. Writing of America in 1968, he told the Jocelsons that everything that wasn't Vietnam was going to be about the African Americans, though the word he used to describe them was distinctly colonial. 48 Jochelson, despite the fact that he had resigned from the CIA sometime before the General Assembly meeting of 13th of May, he left primarily to protect the Congress, so that if asked he could say he was no longer with the agency, 49, said Diana, was irretrievably compromised. His pension was derisory, and certainly no reflection of the enormous contribution he had made. In 1965, Jochelson was employed by the Farfield Foundation as its international director for a period of 2 years at a salary of $21,000, which was paid in 12 installments. Now, in principle at least, the CIA had no further financial obligations towards Jochelson. But Frank Platt and John Thompson, conscious that he had been left high and dry, arranged a termination retirement plan for Jochelson of $30,000 a year, payable from the capital reserve of the Farfield. According to Thompson, this reserve amounted to $1 million. Unable, for some reason, to return this fund to its donors, Thompson suggested that it be made immediately available, Part 50. Jochelson's handshake, more brass than golden, accounted for a fraction of the termination fund of the Farfield. How the rest was dispersed is not recorded, before even the Ramparts exposures appeared. Senator Mike Mansfield demanded a wide-ranging congressional investigation of all clandestine financing by the CIA. President Johnson opted instead for a special 3-man committee composed of Undersecretary of State Nicholas Katzenbach, Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare John Gardner, and CIA Director Richard Helms. The Katzenbach Committee's final report, issued on the 29th of March 1967, concluded that it should be the policy of the U.S. government that no federal agency shall provide any covert financial assistance or support, direct or indirect, to any of the nation's educational or private voluntary organizations. 50 were. The report set 31st December 1967 as the target date for the termination of all such covert agency funding. This was to allow the CIA opportunity to make a number of substantial terminal grants, a technique known as surge funding, to many of its operations. In the case of Radio Free Europe, this was enough to carry it over for a full 2 years of operations. The Katzenbach Report has been widely referred to as the instrument by which the government enjoined the CIA in future from this type of activity. But the CIA had a very different interpretation of what they could do in the post-Katzenbach era. According to the Select Committee Report on Government Intelligence Activities of 1976, Deputy Director of Plans Desmond Fitzgerald circulated the following guidance to all field offices after the report was published. A. Covert relations with commercial U.S. organizations are not, repeat, not barred. B. Covert funding overseas of foreign-based international organizations is permitted. 52. In other words, in the field of international covert operations, nothing at all had changed. Thus, when the CIA decided to continue funding Forum World Features, a Congress for Cultural Freedom spinoff, beyond 1967, it did so with no impediment. For although Johnson adopted the Katzenbach Report as official government policy, it was not issued as an executive order or enacted as a statute. It had no firm legal status. Reading between the lines and observing that there was no bottom line, an editorial in the Nation judged that the report was piously expedient, evasion by definition, and concluded Mr. Johnson's ringing slogan, "The Great Society begins to sound like one of the more cynical utterances of the Bourbon monarchs." 10 years later, a government inquiry criticized the fact that many of the restrictions developed by the CIA in response to the events of 1967 appeared to be security measures aimed at preventing further public disclosures, which could jeopardize sensitive CIA operations. They did not represent significant rethinking of where boundaries ought to be drawn in a free society. 54.